No, Mr. Spock.
So the Democrats.
What is the Democratic Party? On one level, that's rather a simple question. It's a U.S. political organization that endorses candidates, campaigns for election, and seeks, when in office, to govern. It has 48,019,985 registered voters as of 2019. It has existed for almost 230 years. On another level, however, things become murky. There are no membership requirements for joining. The party lacks a set of unifying ideological principles to which members pledge adherence. Its members often vote at odds with one another or support policies that flatly contradict the rhetoric they employ when speaking to voters. Where lies the contradiction? This video will try and prove the following assertions. The Democrats have always been dominated by socioeconomic elites. This is somewhat elementary, as it is those with wealth that tend to have the leisure and security that enables them to enter political life. It's also a party that has often used anti-establishment rhetoric to win support, that has taken up the mantle of the other. And yet its solutions to the problems that plague those outsider groups have invariably been channeled towards the most conservative solutions available, the kind of solutions that do not threaten to upend the status quo. Unlike the Republican Party, itself dominated by elites of its own, who these days hinge electoral victory on the rhetoric of racism, evangelism, and small government platitudes, the Democrats have since the New Deal era favored pro-labor, populist, and/or progressive rhetoric about change, in order to gain the votes necessary to elect candidates. Once elected, Democrats only enact progressive policies grudgingly after much grassroots rabble-rousing. The limited progress that is achieved by Democratic majorities, for it is always limited, gives many politically active people some sense of optimism that the Democrats, with all their faults, are in the end worth their political labor.
Stupid! Stupid! Stupid!
This optimism, in turn, funnels efforts at actually upending the status quo into the proper channels, where radicalism chokes in a morass of party notables, red tape, lobbying dollars, and ideological hostility.
I mean, just nasty and corrupt and disgusting.
Where hope remains a 4-year slogan. The Democrats are now a party for the capitalists, that latest batch of political elites. The proof is in their legacy and their history, and it is also in their contemporary organization. Let's start with the past and trace the evolution of the party since its founding. Then we can turn to how the party currently operates, where it gets its funding, what kind of politicians it elects, and what kind of policies it supports. Chapter 1. The History. The Democratic Party's legacy of support for white man's democracy, for slavery, for Jim Crow, its limited and begrudging New Deal reforms, its recent turn towards neoliberalism, all illustrate the ultimately conservative nature of the Democratic Party. We will review this history, doing our best to marry brevity with detail, generalities with nuance. Part 1. Founding the Party. Anti-Federalists formed the Democratic Republicans, aka Jeffersonians, in 1792. Jeffersonians railed against the concentrations of wealth and the machinations of merchants and financiers, idealizing the yeoman farmer as the kind of citizen most perfectly suited to the Republican form of government. The leaders of the new party were predominantly slave owners, thus possessing the wealth concentrated within the bones and sinews of other human beings. Those with an inkling of conscience, like Jefferson, told themselves that slavery would inevitably fade away in the face of vaguely defined economic progress, and so went on living lives that fundamentally contradicted their stated ethics. Despite being a slave owner, Jefferson often gets high marks from historians and commentators for being the author of the Declaration of Independence, and therefore one of the most famous and influential people to put pen to paper regarding the defense of liberty. But what did he do when he actually had political power? As president, his most impactful achievement was the Louisiana Purchase, finalized in 1803. Although his intention was to gain more land for the Empire of Liberty, i.e. for the use of citizen farmers, in fact, the fertile land of the Mississippi Basin was purchased and exploited by slave owners. Jefferson's signature legacy, therefore, ushered in a generation of rapid, brutal, and economically potent expansion of the slave-based forced labor system. Slavery, alas, would not die of its own accord. The party rechristened itself the Democrats in 1824, with Andrew Jackson as the standard-bearer. Jackson championed the aggressive cotton slaveocracy in the Southwest, and as much as any one individual can claim credit for founding the party as we know it today. The phenomenon of Jacksonian democracy pioneered many of the trappings of modern bourgeois democratic politics: mass electioneering, the spoils system, urban patronage machines, political conventions, and primary elections being the most salient examples. This form of democracy used a mass following based on almost universal suffrage of white males to protect a core of pro-slavery elites. Relying as they did upon slave labor, the planter class thought it could afford a modicum of political representation for poorer whites, especially if those political reforms affected Northern capitalists more than Southern slavers. In 1847, President James Polk happily led the nation towards its manifest destiny, severing half of Mexico in the process, and thus opening up great swaths of territory that both Northern and Southern elites coveted as sites of economic expansion. Slavery now threatened to expand west as it had once spread south, destroying the delicate compromises that hitherto kept the Federation together. As the antebellum period matured, it became increasingly clear that the advent of industrial capitalism was producing antagonisms all over the place, but notably between the economy of the North, which increasingly relied on merchants and wage laborers, and that of the South, dominated by the forced labor camps of the slaveocracy, but also filled with small white farmers. Northern members of the Whig Party and its successor, the Republican Party, tended to favor capitalist industrial development and included financiers, bankers, merchants, manufacturers, and entrepreneurs. They evangelized an ideology of free labor, i.e., the individual freedom to earn a wage based on one's work, the freedom to succeed based on one's own merits. Most anti-capitalist resistance coalesced around an anti-monopoly crusade funneled through the Jacksonian Democratic Party. This movement united trade unions and labor spokesmen with small farmers of the upland South and lower Northwest, who were apprehensive of the Industrial Revolution. Although Democratic leaders, especially in the South, benefited from the trade relationship that routed slave-made cotton into Northern factories that then refined it using poorly paid wage labor, the greatest Democratic support came from those outside of this system. Workers who resented the de-skilling of artisan occupations and the dependency of wage labor, Catholic immigrants offended by Yankee Protestant efforts to reform their drinking habits or force their children into public schools, heirs of the Jefferson-Jackson distrust of banks and corporations, small farmers who disliked urbanites, merchants, banks, Yankees, and other busybodies. It is notable that this first great anti-capitalist movement tried to fight its economic foes through a political party led in large part by those who benefited from industrial capitalism, the slave aristocracy. But the ruling class itself is not a monolith, and although this state of affairs made them wealthy, rich Southerners were apprehensive over the growing power of Northern businesses and the increasingly vocal cries of the emancipation movement. Thus, the slavery question tore at the political fabric of the young Federation. People divided not only along regional lines, but within their own political parties as well. The Democratic Party split between Northern Democrats who tried to preserve the economic symbiosis of the status quo, and Southern firebrands who sought to maintain their monopoly of federal power and, when the election of Lincoln seemed to signal the end of that possibility, became the leaders of the secessionists. Part 2. Post-Civil War Developments. The outcome of the Civil War established the dominance of industrial capital over slave capital, and established the overwhelming predominance of the two major federal parties, the Republicans and Democrats. In so doing, it also cemented the coalitions that backed these parties. The brief hope of Reconstruction, which saw freed blacks voting in large numbers, was snuffed out by Southern Democrats and Northern businessmen, leaving party politics in the hands of elite leaders and their white voters. As it developed through the Gilded Age, the working class of the United States dissipated its political power into the two major parties. Native-born Protestant workers tended to support the Republicans. Immigrant workers, often Catholics from Ireland, Italy, or Poland, were thus left for the democratic urban political machines that consolidated in northern cities. The various populist and socialist parties sometimes won state-level support, even regional power in Congress, but never achieved the same national level of support and organization that the two major parties maintained throughout this period. The corruption and turmoil of the Gilded Age prompted radicalism and populism among workers, and progressivism among the middle class. Progressivism was an intellectual rather than a political movement. We thus see progressives in both major parties. They emphasized hygiene and expertise.
I just want to be pure.
Railing against the corruption and graft they saw as infecting U.S. democracy. Their solutions thus tended to promote structural changes that curtailed popular involvement in government in favor of better government. So, appointed managers instead of popularly elected mayors, reduction of voting suffrage so as to prevent fraud, etc. Unlike socialists and communists who supported direct workplace democracy, worker control over the decisions made in the economic sphere, progressives tended to favor market competition, continuing the private ownership of the economy, but preferably without the giant economic trusts. The first Democrat elected in 20 years, Woodrow Wilson apogeed this original progressive movement. Wilson's political project was one of conservative reforms, which he hoped would achieve limited democracy, orderly government, and a balanced economy. His 1912 campaign hinged on the new freedom, using an expertly guided national power to bust trusts, protect labor unions, and reinvigorate democracy itself by championing small businesses and market competition. Once in office, Wilson made good on some of his campaign promises. Although he abandoned the idea of busting economic giants, he did succeed in increasing government regulation of the economy by passing the, for instance, Clayton Act, which sought to regulate mergers and acquisitions and also gave additional labor protections to workers. He also passed the Keating-Owen Act, which briefly outlawed child labor before being struck down by the Supreme Court, and his administration also created the Federal Reserve and the Federal Trade Commission. At base, however, his presidency failed to address the fundamental power that private industry had over economic life, nor did it reverse the existing policy of U.S. imperialism. Remember that pulsing throughout U.S. history is the beating heart of indigenous genocide, that necessary organ of conquest without which the United States could not have come into being. We emphasized the anti-capitalist tendencies of Jacksonian Democrats, but we should never forget that much of his presidential muscle was exercised in the elimination of indigenous people. The land upon which Southern forced labor camps were built often had to be purchased, cajoled, stolen for that purpose. Wilson continued this legacy when he embraced moral imperialism, believing that spreading U.S. freedom and democracy to other countries also meant spreading U.S. goods and services. His adventures in Mexico and in Europe thus brought an unprecedented level of U.S. involvement in world affairs, cracking open new markets for U.S. businesses. And of course, Wilson's progressivism rested on a foundation of white supremacy. He supported the restriction of black suffrage in the South in the name of preventing election fraud. His pronouncements on national self-determination did not include the vast majority of those peoples existing under the boot heel of the European Empire. And of course, his progressivism found the ideal reactionary outlet when he brought the United States into World War I, where his administration spent the rest of the decade curtailing free speech and arresting Reds.
Confiscated. I'll take it with me to Washington on Wednesday.
On whose authority?
The authority of the Attorney General.
had to expose them. And once they told the American people what communism was, people won't have nothing to do with communism now. They know what it is. But then they didn't know. It was a new thing.
Part 3. The New Deal. Wilson, although he had been governor of New Jersey, was a Virginian, and the Democratic Party remained largely dominated by Southern leadership well into the 20th century. The stock market crash and subsequent depression, however, allowed Northern Democrats like Franklin Roosevelt to wedge their way into party leadership. This did not, however, make FDR a radical or an outsider in any fundamental sense. He was simply an astute politician who understood that a little progressivism, more in rhetoric than in policy, was necessary to achieve victory and keep the radicals at bay. Wrote a contemporary journalist turned historian, "All FDR apparently needed in order to win the 1932 nomination, and the election for that matter, was to exercise his charm, look just conservative enough to fall heir to the votes of Republicans who were sick of Hoover, look just radical enough to keep the rebellious from turning socialist or communist, and not make enemies. So he spoke kindly of the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid, but failed to specify exactly how this man should be remembered. He said that the country demands bold, persistent experimentation, but engaged in his speeches chiefly in the sort of experimentation practiced by the chameleon. He had less to lose by facing two ways than by standing fast, by talking about candor than by exercising it." We should not be surprised that Roosevelt did not wish to upend things too much. FDR was a patrician, running a campaign of vague platitudes and little substance. His wealth put him in the same social circles as many of his political foes and critics. As a member of the capitalist class himself, it should hardly surprise us that he did not seek their total annihilation. His policies did ultimately endorse financial, commercial, and monetary reform and regulation, but these efforts sought to repair the economic order, not replace it with a newer model. To his critics in business, FDR said, "I am the best friend the profit system ever had." In campaign speeches in 1936, he proclaimed himself the savior of the system of private profit and free enterprise. These protestations bear the mark of reality. Roosevelt's initial programs in 1933 focused on finance and banking. The bank holiday, the Emergency Banking Act, the Glass-Steagall Act, all focused on propping up financial institutions, instilling confidence back into investors and depositors, and/or reforming the stock exchange. And much of this was important work, but it hardly mattered in the everyday lives of the millions of poor, unemployed, increasingly militant workers. Indeed, unemployment still stood at 20% as 1934 ended. The more progressive policies of 1935 and 36 came about only because of continued agitation from below. Major strikes in Toledo, Minneapolis, and San Francisco indicated the militant attitude labor evinced from 1934 onwards.
Razor, I have made a fist and I'm thinking of using it.
Led by political radicals, their tactics included mass picketing and self-defense against police and scabs. And this terrified leaders in both business circles and among the more conservative American Federation of Labor. Proponents of reforms like the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA, and the Social Security Act thus presented such legislation as necessary to short-circuit radicalization. Representative Connery, speaking in 1934, warned, "You have seen strikes in Toledo, you have seen Minneapolis, you have seen San Francisco, and you have seen some of the southern textile strikes. But you have not seen yet the gates of hell opened, and that is what is going to happen from now on if the NLRA is not passed." It was through this process of more mild reform that radicals were defanged and labor interests were partially incorporated into the national platform of the Democratic Party. For indeed, not all workers found respite and protection within the pages of New Deal legislation. Farm workers, many of them Southern sharecroppers upon whom regional elites depended for their wealth, were left to fend for themselves, and this, of course, disproportionately affected black people. And although organized labor was now part of the Democratic Party's platform, it was organized business that remained in control. Whenever there was a conflict between the two blocs, the latter tended to triumph. Labor leaders continually found themselves trimming their demands in an increasingly frantic effort to appease their compatriots within the party. Nevertheless, the party now had a functioning national coalition that would allow it to maintain control of Congress if not the presidency, for decades to come. The limits of these reforms, and the New Deal-style liberalism from which they emerged, soon became evident. First, New Deal liberalism refused to contest private ownership of the economy. Corporations remained paramount in labor relations and in control of all major economic institutions. U.S. liberalism didn't support nationalization of industries or grand social welfare policies that might cover citizens from diapers to dentures. Liberals accepted that the primary aim of economic policy was to maintain conditions for corporate-led economic growth. This ignored the demands of radicals and, ominously, left the fundamentals of the economy essentially unchanged from the days of the robber barons. Second, with the advent of the Cold War, liberals did not question the necessity of expanding the U.S. military to an unprecedented degree for what was supposed to be peacetime, nor did liberal Democrats object to the often aggressive and nakedly imperialistic ventures into which U.S. military assets were plunged. In fact, an expanding military was one pillar upon which liberalism rested. Massive federal expansions of education, for instance, via programs like the GI Bill of Rights and the National Defense Education Act of 1958, were framed by Democrats as necessary in order to keep up with the Russians, rather than components of a human's right to education. Part 4. The Great Society. The 1960s saw the beginning of a tectonic shift within the voter base of the Democratic Party. For decades, there had been a coalition of working people across the nation, black as well as white, that kept the Democrats in power, especially in Congress. As one section of the Democrats responded to civil rights agitation and put legislative muscle towards achieving some modicum of reform, racist elements of the Democratic Party and voter base, notably in the South and West, revolted. Lyndon Johnson and others foresaw the loss of at least some of these voters ahead of time and thus needed to find a way to replace racist white voters with those of re-enfranchised black people. At the same time, LBJ and other white liberals sought to undercut black militants who, during the escalation of the Vietnam War, were questioning the very foundation upon which U.S. politics rested.
What?
The solution to both of these issues was the Great Society. And through the Great Society, particularly the War on Poverty programs, the Johnson administration hoped to cultivate a moderate black political leadership, one loyal to the Democratic Party. This was similar to what Nixon would seek to accomplish in the next decade via his focus on black capitalism. But alas for the Texan, LBJ's hopes that the Great Society would purchase allegiance from the poor withered away amid the disintegration of the U.S. Army, insurrectionary riots across the country's major cities, and widespread protest against the Vietnam War. Part 5. Carter, Reagan, and the Neoliberal Turn. Carter is often remembered as the last of the New Deal liberals before the age of Reagan began. In point of fact, that honor, such as it is, belongs to Nixon, who succeeded in expanding federal domestic spending more than any other post-FDR president. Indeed, Carter was, in many ways, the first neoliberal president, the first in an unbroken succession of leaders who equated business health with public health, market activity with civic activity, stock markets with real life. Though elected on a platform of cleaning up the swamp of corruption and scandal left in the wake of Vietnam, Watergate, and the revelations of the Church Commission, Carter's solution turned out to be less government rather than better government, less public power and more private power. Take, for instance, Carter's 1978 State of the Union address, the first he gave to the nation.
Bit by bit, we are chopping down the thicket of unnecessary federal regulations by which government too often interferes in our personal lives and our personal business. We really need to realize that there is a limit to the role and the function of government. Government cannot solve our problems. It can't set our goals. It cannot define our vision. Government cannot eliminate poverty or provide a bountiful economy or reduce inflation or save our cities or cure illiteracy or provide energy. And government cannot mandate goodness. Only a true partnership between government and the people can ever hope to reach these goals.
Or witness Carter's performance during his 1980 debate with candidate Ronald Reagan.
Yes. Howard, I'm a Southerner, and I share the basic beliefs of my region about an excessive government intrusion into the private affairs of American citizens and also into the private affairs of the free enterprise system. One of the commitments that I made was to deregulate the major industries of this country. We've been remarkably successful with the help of the Democratic Congress. We've deregulated the air industry, the rail industry, the trucking industry, financial institutions, now working on the communications industry.
Carter wasn't lying either. His administration reversed the long period of increases in spending on domestic programs. His 1978 tax plan anticipated Reaganomics by cutting capital gains taxes for the wealthy, while boosting Social Security taxes on the working class. This was the first time since the 1930s that Congress had passed an unambiguously regressive tax plan, and this Congress was controlled by Democrats. He signed the Monetary Control Act of 1980, which removed all remaining controls on interest rates and repealed the federal law prohibiting usury. This was one of the major pieces of legislation to chip away at New Deal-era financial regulations. Even in foreign affairs, Carter was no peacenik. He sharply increased the military budget, which ballooned from $104.6 billion in 1977 to $143.6 billion in 1980, reinstated registration for the military draft, and created the Rapid Deployment Force for intervention in the Middle East. In fact, the Carter Doctrine of treating the Persian Gulf as essential to U.S. interests would go on to warp decades of U.S. foreign policy. Although Reagan won the presidency from Carter, Congress remained in the hands of the Democrats, who resisted Reagan's right-wing policies only meekly. The Senate Budget Committee unanimously endorsed Reagan's 1981 budget cuts, which wiped out years of social welfare gains. In 1985, key Democrats, including the liberal lion Ed Kennedy of Massachusetts, voted for the Graham-Rudman-Hollings bill, which imposed mandatory budget cuts. Various Democrats also supported Reagan's invasion of Grenada, military aid for UNITA in Angola, aid to the Contras, and various weapons programs, like research into chemical weapons or the Midget Man missile program. Part 6. The New Democrats. While Democrats remained as broadly supportive of the economic status quo as their partisan enemies, they hated losing. And so 12 years of Republican presidents stung. After all, they thought of themselves as the proper stewards of the nation. They could not countenance leaving the nation in the hands of the out-of-touch, like H.W. Bush, or the retrograde, like Pat Buchanan, or the plain incompetent, like Reagan. And Democratic leaders increasingly blamed the remaining liberals in the party for their electoral woes.
Your fault!
So, following Carter's defeat, the DNC heaved rightward, establishing the Democratic Business Council, or DBC, an advisory group of leading CEOs to develop a Democratic alternative to Reaganism. At the same time, young Democrats like Bill Clinton helped launch the Democratic Leadership Council, or DLC, to promote more conservative Democratic candidates and policies. Major corporations like R.J. Reynolds Tobacco, Atlantic Richfield, which is oil, Georgia Pacific, which is wood and building products, Martin Marietta, which is a military contractor, and Prudential Bach, which is finance and insurance, bankrolled the DLC and its conservative policies. And these right-leaning Democrats also included hitherto moderately liberal men like Joe Biden, who veered rightward throughout the 1980s, sometimes passing Reagan himself, as was the case with the war on drugs. This process of excising New Deal liberalism from the party, of replacing it with neoliberalism, birthed the New Democrats, the Clintonites, who have controlled party leadership ever since. The Republicans lost the presidency in 1992, but the Democrats who entered the executive branch after 12 years were no longer the liberals of decades past. Indeed, the Clinton-Gore administration, attempting to cater to white voters who had been leaving the party in droves since the late 1960s, pursued a thoroughly conservative political project. Clinton had campaigned on the promise of stimulus money and middle-class tax cuts, But the stimulus package fell to a Republican filibuster, and Clinton soon dropped the tax cut proposal altogether. He then supported a 1993 budget that enshrined deficit reduction as the chief domestic aim. And of course, those deficits would be reduced largely by cutting welfare rolls. Meanwhile, NAFTA established free trade as the core of the administration's foreign economic strategy. Clintonites at the time calculated that despite widespread protests, NAFTA would buoy the administration's declining poll numbers, especially among the conservative voters over which New Democrats obsessed. Subsequent bipartisan efforts, happily championed by Clinton, augmented this treaty through the 1994 ratification of the World Trade Organization and the 2000 approval of permanent normal trade relations with China. No previous administration had pushed free trade as hard as Clinton's, and the disastrous effects of these trade policies upon organized labor in the United States reverberate to this day. While his economic policies had been consistently conservative, Clinton did take some limited progressive stands early on, notably in his support for gays in the military and his proposals for healthcare reform. Crushing defeats in these and other areas, however, prompted Clinton to swing even further rightward. As his first term wore on, he and his administration supported vast increases to police and prison budgets via the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, still the largest crime bill in U.S. history, championed the destruction of welfare via the 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, and privatized the epoch-making and publicly funded invention of the Internet via the Telecommunications Act of 1996. His second term was no better, passing laws that finalized the slow bipartisan dismantling of New Deal-era financial regulations, e.g. the Financial Services Modernization Act of 1999. Even his environmental policies were mixed. The administration preserved agreements allowing the mining industry to plunder federal lands and the timber industry to clear-cut old-growth forests. It allowed the opening of some federal land holdings to oil drilling. And although Clinton signed the 1997 Kyoto Agreement, he never attempted to win treaty ratification in the U.S. Senate. Apparently, climate change wasn't worth the political capital. Chapter 2. Contemporary Democrats. Part 1. Obama. Even the much-vaunted election of the country's first black president failed to dislodge the Democrats from their conservatism. Indeed, Obama himself admitted in his memoirs that he did not possess an especially revolutionary soul, and championed predominantly conservative-friendly policies while in office, notably in the realm of economic regulation, where banks were left more consolidated and powerful than ever, the war on terror, which spread across Africa, among other places, healthcare, where insurance companies reaped billions in government-mandated profits, and fossil fuels, the domestic production of which skyrocketed under his administration. Even before becoming president, however, the signs were there. Obama did not have a long political history before entering the White House, but he did do some things, producing a decidedly mixed record as far as progressive bona fides are concerned. Along with more well-known efforts of his, like supporting law-abiding government surveillance programs in pursuance of the war on terror, or criticizing the Iraq War as drawing attention away from the good war, as he called it, in Afghanistan, Obama also spent some of his pre-presidential political career advocating for the Illinois coal industry, and coal more broadly. Let's focus on the coal for a moment, as it's an interesting case study of what the New Democrats and their neoliberal ideology prioritize and emphasize. While serving in the Illinois State Senate, Obama had publicly criticized a mercury regulation proposed by then-President George W. Bush. The state senator considered the regulation to be unfairly favoring Western coal over the kind of coal produced in Illinois. As a U.S. senator, Obama co-sponsored a bill with a Kentucky Republican to provide up to $8 billion in subsidies for coal-to-liquid fuel technologies. While campaigning for president in 2008, Obama supported clean coal technology and said,
"It is true that the planet is getting warmer, and we have to deal with it. But this is America. We figured out how to put a man on the moon in 10 years. You can't tell me we can't figure out how to burn coal that we mine right here in the United States of America and make it work.
It was this legacy that prompted groups like the American Coalition for Clean Coal Electricity, or ACCCE, to support Obama's candidacy. Many coal state Democrats eagerly branded their party's candidate as a friend of coal. Longtime Congressman Nick Rahall of West Virginia, for instance, expressed certainty that Obama would be better for the industry than John McCain. Candidate Obama did not support coal without reservation. Rather, he supported the development of clean coal technology to replace the dirty coal that dominated U.S. power infrastructure. His support for coal-to-liquid fuel subsidies in the Senate, for instance, was ultimately conditioned on a requirement that the fuel's production and use create at least 20% less CO2 than the production and use of conventional petroleum. He also favored the imposition of a federal cap-and-trade system, one that he hoped would cut American greenhouse gas emissions to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Note, however, that as is typical for neoliberals, Obama was promoting a market-based solution to a given problem, trying to use the market mechanisms of supply and demand and cost to regulate something that might better be regulated in more direct ways. In sum, Obama was walking a political tightrope. On the one hand, he understood the power that fossil fuel companies could bring to bear, both in terms of lobbying dollars and, at least in some states, voters. That's why, as a state senator, he pushed against federal regulations he thought unfair to Illinois' coal production in particular. He also understood, intellectually if not on a personal level, the environmental consequences sure to result from untrammeled coal mining in its current form. He hoped that the technology would materialize, with the assistance of federal dollars, that might square this circle and allow coal to continue its energy dominance, albeit in cleaner form. His support for coal would wane as it became clear that so-called clean coal was a pipe dream, but other forms of fossil fuels would continue to receive administration support, notably oil and natural gas. When push came to shove, his administration proved entirely willing to swallow industry talking points about green fossil fuels and ignore the lockstep march towards climate doom. This is in keeping with the legacy of the Democratic Party, which, when left to its own devices and proclivities, tends to cozy up to the ruling class, even as it espouses whatever anti-establishment rhetoric is popular at the time. Part 2. Political Fundraising. The history of the Democratic Party, right up into the present day, provides a great deal of evidence for their fundamentally conservative nature, for their proclivity for co-opting anti-establishment agitation, whether as Jacksonian-era Democrats co-opting anti-capitalist agitation, as progressives and New Deal liberals de-radicalizing the labor movement, or as the current crop of neoliberals turning dissatisfaction at the status quo towards market-oriented solutions. But history is not the only evidence. Campaign financing provides further indication of where the Democrats get their support and therefore where they focus their policies. Indeed, the cozy relationship between the major U.S. political parties and the corporations that dominate our economy is readily attested by how elections get their funding.
I'd be willing to make a deal with anybody that would, sort of see things my way. Make a mighty good deal for both of us.
You mean a little friendly bribery, huh?
Red or blue, elephant or donkey, it's the green of corporate dollars that keeps the partisan lights on, the partisan machines humming. Democrats typically get more corporate dollars from newer sectors of the economy, like communications and electronics, which during the 2010 election cycle gave $21.2 million to Democrats and only $7.3 million to Republicans. The GOP remains anchored in the old economy, like agribusiness, which gave $7.6 million to Republicans in 2010 versus $2.9 million to Democrats, or the energy sector, which gave $10.8 million to Republicans versus only $4.5 million for Democrats. Healthcare and financial institutions tend to give to both parties in roughly equal proportion, especially in election years like 2010, where large swaths of the population, regardless of party, wanted something to be reformed in both those sectors of the economy. So you give money to both parties, ensuring that whoever gets into office, you'll have at least some say in how those reforms are crafted.
All right, Joe, you remember the rules. Heads I win, tails you lose.
What about labor unions? It is true that roughly 90% of labor political contributions go to Democratic candidates. Nevertheless, labor union money is not decisive in Democratic fundraising. In fact, of the $283.4 million in 2010 election contributions to the Democrats that could be associated with an industry or sector, only about 1/4 came from labor and liberal groups. The rest came from business sectors. To reiterate, the Democrats do get support from U.S. labor and liberal special interests, but most of their funding comes from corporations, who, again, often donate to both sides, so that regardless of who wins, they have some influence on future policy. This problem has existed since the modern political parties took form, but has been made all the worse by the destruction of labor power in the U.S. since the 1970s, and the wrecking of our campaign financing by Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United. Part 3. What is a Joe Manchin?
Everybody has their own opinion, right?
We've seen how the Democrats morphed from contradiction to contradiction, championing anti-capitalist agitation while supporting the slavery that fed industrial capitalism, advocating for trust-busting and hygienic democracy while championing the military-backed expansion of U.S. markets overseas, accepting the labor movement into its ranks during and after the New Deal, while capitalists continued their control of the economy, and finally by extending the promise of progress, for some, even as the economy continued its retrograde course deeper and deeper into the Second Gilded Age. In each period, the party itself has been concerned with winning election within the confines of the status quo, using whatever rhetoric a particular era might require in order to win. We can see this win at all costs that don't involve a vast redistribution of power in the career of a Democratic senator from West Virginia who has only recently basked in the limelight of national press attention. Joe Manchin has been in the news a lot lately for his obstinate resistance to the progressive infrastructure legislation currently working its way around Congress, and the Build Back Better agenda more broadly. This degree of resistance to not only Senator Sanders and other progressives, but even to other conservative Democrats like Joe Biden himself, has confused many observers, especially after Manchin refused to compromise when the original spending bill's price tag was cut in half. If we recall the fundamental reality of the Democratic Party, that its policies have ebbed conservative and flowed liberal, while its core mission of defending the ruling class has remained fixed, take into consideration the evolution of the party during the period of neoliberalism, and combine that with the particularities of West Virginia itself, we will get a better understanding of where the conflict resides. Coal is the context of West Virginia, for coal dominates the local economy. Moreover, while the state has had a long and bloody history of labor agitation, the current electorate is more culturally conservative, and thus open to Republicans eager to take up the image of the gun and eagle. Since Democrats are not part and parcel of an ideologically coherent party, but more a vaguely pro-capitalist social club, they're willing to do whatever it takes to win seats, and thus we see reactionaries like Manchin, who the New York Times once described as a centrist and bridge builder, win as a Democrat, but support policies that broadly align with Republicans, almost as if partisan labels mattered not at all. We see this in Manchin's relationship with Obama as well, himself a far from revolutionary figure. Manchin's relationship with Obama really began in late 2010. In October, then-Governor Manchin directed West Virginia to sue the EPA in an effort to overturn new federal rules concerning mountaintop removal drilling. This was one of his last acts as governor, for he had recently won a special election to Senate and assumed office in November of that year. His campaign for Senate is quite illuminating. Consider, for instance, this 2010 campaign ad.
I'm Joe Manchin. I approve this ad because I'll always defend West Virginia.
As your senator, I'll protect our Second Amendment rights. That's why the NRA endorsed me. I'll take on Washington and this administration to get the federal government off of our backs and out of our pockets. I'll cut federal spending, and I'll repeal the bad parts of Obamacare. I sued EPA, and I'll take dead aim at the cap-and-trade bill. Because it's bad for West Virginia.
Although he was subsequently vague as to what exactly he didn't like about the Affordable Care Act, giving vague platitudes about the bill's partisan passage, its abortion funding, its cumbersome nature, and its overreaching regulation. But that vagueness helped him, as it had helped FDR decades earlier, and he won a hotly contested race. In 2011, Manchin proposed his first Senate bill, an attempt to rein in EPA overreach. He also supported construction of the Keystone XL pipeline, although so too did Obama at the time. Moreover, Manchin was the only Democratic senator to support the Energy Tax Prevention Act, which sought to prohibit the EPA from regulating greenhouse gases at all. He clearly had a bee in his bonnet for even the limited environmental reforms of the Obama administration. Remember, although Obama championed some green energy initiatives, like funding for additional green energy research in the recovery bill, his administration also supported an expansion of domestic fossil fuel production. So it's not like Obama was radical in this regard, or not open to compromise at all. Manchin did not endorse Barack Obama for re-election in 2012, saying that he had some real differences with the presumptive nominees of both major parties. He faulted Obama's economic and energy policies, but also questioned Romney's understanding of the challenges facing ordinary people, something I'm sure Manchin knows a lot about. Given how vitriolic partisanship has become in recent years, this lack of endorsement seems quite stunning in retrospect, and no doubt added to Manchin's growing reputation as a bipartisan builder of bridges. Alas, his engineering projects consistently favored conservative blueprints, party affiliation notwithstanding. In December 2014, Manchin continued his crusade against the EPA. He was one of 6 Democratic senators to sign a letter to the EPA urging it to give states more time to comply with federal rules on power plants. The letter further called for elimination of the 2020 targets in the final rule, which mandated that states take action by that year, doing their part to reach the EPA's goal of a 30% carbon cut by 2030. Manchin went further in 2016, criticizing Obama's environmental regulations as a war on coal and demanding a proper balance between the needs of the environment and the coal business. This idea that the Obama administration had been waging a war against coal had taken form years earlier, first with Republicans, but soon with coal-centric Democrats as well. Fossil fuels are a bipartisan issue, after all. In the spring of 2009, with a cap-and-trade bill in Congress, politicians in coal-producing states started blaming Obama specifically, rather than other states or congressional leaders, for a war on coal. The rhetoric heated up in the summer of 2009 as Ohio Republicans and Virginia editors accused Obama of waging war on coal-producing states, then ratcheted up further during the 2010 West Virginia elections, where politicians from both parties, including Manchin, painted themselves as coal lovers. The subsequent obliteration of coal's economic vitality was laid solely at the feet of the first black president. Economics, however, told a different story. In 2011, U.S. coal was vibrant, recovering from the recession and planning enormous expansion. Then, between 2011 and 2016, it tanked. U.S. coal production dropped by 27%. Domestic demand fell 30%. Demand for exports dried up as well. It was exports that were driving the U.S. coal boom in 2011, and it was exports that account for more than half the decline in demand through 2016. Subsequent growth in India wouldn't be enough to make up the difference. Moreover, increased competition by cheap, fracked natural gas, and to a much lesser degree renewables like solar and wind, hastened this decline further still. EPA regulations, on the other hand, played a comparatively minor role. Despite the realities of domestic energy production and demand, or of global trade, politicians like Manchin continued to parrot this narrative, which helped solidify the Republican fiction that Obama had been a radical when it came to the environment. Facts, however, were not convenient for Manchin's political aspirations, nor was loyalty to the party's figurehead. Indeed, his political career evinces not only the Democratic Party's loyalty to economic elites, in this case coal, and its desire to win at almost any cost, so long as the status quo broadly is maintained, but the party's somewhat localized nature as well. The Democratic Party is, after all, not a wholly unified and coherent apparatus, but more a series of local machines tied to various special interests. This is a legacy of the antebellum divide over slavery and the early 20th century's reign of the great bosses. And although the Democrats are far more coherent on the national stage than hitherto, divisions and rivalries and local differences remain. The divide between centrists and progressives gets a lot of press these days, But even more conservative neoliberals like Manchin and Obama, and now Biden, can have impactful differences among themselves. Concluding remarks.
I'd like to share a revelation that I've had.
Concerning the U.S.'s two-party system, one observer opined in 1891 that the Republicans and Democrats were two great gangs of political speculators who alternatively take possession of the state power and exploit it by the most corrupt means and for the most corrupt ends. And the nation is powerless against these two great cartels of politicians who are ostensibly its servants, but in reality exploit and plunder it. It seems that many today, perhaps to their surprise, would agree with the words of famed communist thinker Frederick Engels. His words encapsulate a fundamental reality about the United States.
You can't polish a turd.
Its two-party system is really a one-party system with two factions. The party itself reflects the interests of the propertied or capitalist class, those who control the means of production, the lands, factories, raw materials, financial institutions, intellectual properties. This capitalist class uses control over the means of production to fund both political parties. Ergo, it's not particularly surprising that those parties tend to favor policies that jive with their donor base. While the Republican Party, hostile to accommodating adjustments and therefore conservative, and the Democratic Party, recently at least favoring some adjustments of the status quo and therefore liberal, have some real and clear differences, they both ultimately serve this master class. Democrats often talk a good anti-establishment talk.
I'm here to show faceless corporate America they can't just walk in here without so much as a how-to-do and shove the little guy aside, even when I'm that faceless corporate America.
But once in office, they'd prefer to concern themselves with the staffing of the government, not the altering of the state. The current split between ultra-conservative Democrats like Manchin, conservative reformers like Biden, and progressives like Sanders, technically not even a Democrat himself, reflects the unfortunate reality of American electoral politics. It is extremely difficult to steer meaningful and impactful pro-worker reforms through either major political party. Radical Republicans took advantage of the Civil War to pass some serious reforms, some of which were watered down, others entirely destroyed by the Supreme Court, some left unenforced when more conservative Republicans preferred reconciliation with former slavers over progress for former slaves. Progressive Democrats heeded the agitation of workers in the 1930s and under the astute leadership of FDR, passed some parts of a functioning welfare state. But just as business interests ultimately retained control of the Republicans in the 1870s, so too in the 1970s did corporations marginalize New Deal liberals, replacing them with the neoliberal New Democrats, of which Manchin and Obama are just the latest batch. The differences between the Democrats now largely stem from the realities of working within a fundamentally capitalist political party. One faction, reminiscent of FDR, understands that reform is necessary if the status quo is to maintain itself more broadly. Another faction, more beholden to the narrow interests of their locales and their specific corporate donors, balk at upsetting the neoliberal apple cart. If the reformers continue to find themselves blocked by conservatives within their own party, then the pressure building beneath the political surface will have nowhere to vent, making an explosion, with all its danger and promise, all the more likely. Hey, I hope you enjoyed the video. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff that I didn't cover. You know, it's 200 plus years of history, so you're going to have to cut out a lot, even if the video is over nearly an hour long. How long is it, the edit? Anyways, I did want to take a quick moment to thank my research assistants, Peter, who helped a lot with Jacksonian and pre-Civil War American history in general, and Rusty, who actually just turned 2 years old, so he's an old standby. He's the FDR expert. Bill is hiding in one of his little boxes, but he was integral with the Clinton administration and the transition into the 21st century. So, as a reminder, I do have a book out. He Was Our Man in Washington, A History of the Obama Years, now out from Zero Books. It covers a lot of stuff about Obama. I added a lot of stuff about coal in this video because it was kind of a niche example of broader trends that I cover in this book about, you know, his commitment to fossil fuels and the limits of what he tried to do to address the climate crisis and everything else. There's also stuff in here about the pipeline battles and how he interacted with indigenous peoples, which, sad to say, it's not much different from historically what's happened. But yeah, it's available through Amazon if you want to give Bezos money, Barnes & Noble, IndieBound, that kind of thing. So Richard Wolff liked it. I was kind of surprised he even gave me the time of day, but he thought it was pretty great. So maybe you will too. It's probably too late to get it for the holidays unless you want to get the electronic version of it. But maybe a good tax season purchase. I don't know. This stuff is always relevant, it seems. So if you want to see more videos, let me know in the comments what you want to see, and I'll probably not make it, but you never know. Yeah. See you next time.